In Volume 1 of this presentation on Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, I discussed the major themes of the novel, and that's where most of the references are. The argument in Brave New World is exaggerated. Huxley is primarily looking at the conditions that would lead humanity to sacrifice freedom for stability, but it's clear that people would have to be pushed pretty far for such a desperate solution. And as I argued, lack of adaptability is not actually a viable long-term strategy for stability. And of course, Huxley would say that's a price that is not worth paying because it would entail the loss of human emotion, individualism, freedom, religion, art, creativity. And Mustafa Mond, the bureaucrat that the protagonist speaks to, is very upfront about this. It was all of those things were sacrificed, and in his mind, it was worth it. But if you look at the novel, the world in the novel, it's the completely fossilized caste system with zero social mobility is quite a nightmare. So I would like to read Island at some point, his thought experiment on what a utopian society would look like, one of his last novels published in 1962. But this volume, Volume 2, is essentially a case study of the continued relevance of Huxley's novel, A Brave New World. I'm focusing here more on the controversial history of eugenics, which really alarmed Aldous Huxley when he was writing. The research on genetic engineering I found as a literary scholar to be a little perplexing, but it was interesting. Definitely the scientists today seem quite a bit more careful and rational than the eugenicists of Huxley's day. But there's still some serious questions about this, and the novel is relevant. And the Human Nature documentary on Netflix that discusses genetic engineering and the CRISPR technology evidently thought that Huxley is still relevant. He's mentioned in the documentary. Even though the novel doesn't necessarily get into DNA, that research really comes after the novel is published. Then I'll conclude with observations on the COVID pandemic through the lens of skepticism that I've fine-tuned after reading this novel. I'm not talking about the vaccines. I vaccinated myself. I'm more looking at the politicization and groupthink from both sides of the political spectrum. I'd advise looking at Volume 1 first, but to reiterate, if you haven't seen that, this is in Aldous Huxley's foreword of Brave New World, my edition. Brave New World is a book about the future and whatever its artistic and philosophical qualities. A book about the future can interest us only if its prophecies look as though they might conceivably come true. So, it's intended as a cautionary tale, but if you read the novel and you look at our society today, it was very prescient in many ways. There's a lot of ways to look at the novel, to look at its relevance, drugs, big pharma, etc. I'm focused here, my case study here is on eugenics, genetic engineering, and the COVID pandemic, but the novel talks about a lot. I've just chosen this as my way to look at how Huxley's concerns are in some ways still relevant. With that said, I'll move on to the topic of eugenics. The film Gattaca, inspired by Brave New World, describes a dystopian society that uses genetic engineering, a term that derives, I believe, from science fiction genre itself, to create a caste system, one that denies equality of opportunity. Brave New World itself doesn't really get into genetics, genetic engineering, but one technique it is prescient about is the technique of in vitro fertilization, test tube babies. The history of genetics, though, DNA, the discovery of the structure of the DNA, really doesn't get going until Huxley has published his novel in 1932. Coincidentally, just before working on this presentation, I saw the Netflix documentary Human Nature, which mentions Aldous Huxley and Gattaca, and it discusses the innovative and Nobel Prize-winning CRISPR gene editing technique. One of the people that they interviewed was Dr. George Daly Dean at Harvard Medical School, who stated that he was startled by how a book written in 1932 could have had the foresight to predict in vitro fertilization. This technique, fertilizing an egg with sperm in vitro, raises a number of issues. During the screening process, one can select for desirable traits and undesirable traits, and of course not everyone is going to agree exactly on what is desirable and undesirable, but one thing is likely to be undesirable, disease. But of course, a lot of concerns are raised about that. Where do you draw the line on what to include, what to not include? Overall, it's a pretty remarkable technology for those who, through no fault of their own, cannot conceive in the natural way. But if you've read Brave New World, it's the only way people are produced in laboratories. And of course, the nuclear family has been extinguished. So there's a lot of debate recently on what eugenics means, and I was kind of lost on when eugenics ended and genetics began. To focus on the Brave New World, as a person who reads a lot of literature, I do sympathize with the responsible scientists who can get annoyed with novelists and filmmakers, but what's important to understand is that the arguments in art, by necessity, have to be emotional. They're not scientific arguments, exactly, and they tend to be overstated. That can be annoying even for me, who I don't do science, but I can understand how they would look at it. And the argument in Brave New World is, of course, overstated to get the point across as a cautionary tale. In my view, and I'll get into the details in a moment, I tend, as a neurotic person anyways, to err on the side of caution, but that doesn't mean don't use the technology. There's some bad apples in the scientific community, but none of the scientists I listened to in the Human Nature documentary that are working on the CRISPR technology or utilizing it in some way in their own field seemed even remotely close to the eugenicists of Huxley's day. I'd advise also, if you see Human Nature, which is on Netflix, also watch Dangerous Idea. It's a good documentary on the misuse of science and goes into eugenics and scientific racism, which is pseudoscience. But there is some science there, and I don't think they really went into the merits of genetic engineering. So I wouldn't view one without the other. You need to get a balanced view of it. So it was pretty wild, to put it one way, to look at what people in the scientific community, in the intelligentsia, were saying. And I'm not talking about the Nazis. I'm talking about France, the United Kingdom, the United States in particular, what they were saying, what they advocated when Huxley was writing his novel. And when you look at it, you could understand why he was concerned. So first, eugenics is the artificial selection of desirable hereditary traits to improve future generations. The novel, in part, is a product of Huxley's concerns about the unethical eugenics policies of the early 20th century. The caste system in the world state is not based on genetic engineering in contrast to Gattaca, that is the focus, but the world state uses, as I said, in vitro fertilization that overlaps to a degree with genetic engineering today, and the traits in the novel for the specific classes are very specified for the alphas, betas, gammas, etc. To quote from the novel, "We believe in happiness and stability. A society of alphas couldn't fail to be unstable and miserable. Imagine a factory staffed by alphas, that is to say by separate and unrelated individuals of good heredity and conditioned, so as to be capable within limits of making a free choice and assuming responsibilities. Imagine it." In short, I'm thinking of Captain Quint from Jaws, who said, too many captains on this boat or island. The point being, it's like you need some kind of hierarchical structure. Alpha at the top, betas, competent subordinates who know what they're doing. There is utility to that. It's a hierarchy that becomes outdated is when it's a problem and when it becomes fossilized, in a sense. And it really is creepy when you realize, having read the novel, there is a kernel of truth to almost everything the controller says, Mustafa Mond. If the people who founded the world state were complete fools, they wouldn't have succeeded. So it is true that every civilization has had a hierarchy of some sort. Patriarchy, matriarchy, whatever. More often patriarchy, and some more egalitarian than others. Here, the goal is, in Brave New World, to completely remove mobility altogether. So I'll definitely say this more than once. It's clear to me that the majority of the scientists, at least the ones they interviewed in Human Nature, were far more careful and rational, and indeed, this is probably even more important, better regulated than they were in Huxley's day. And to borrow George Carlin's phrase, a liberal like myself, for the most part, if the liberal PC campus assholes could listen to what people were saying 100 years ago, they would short circuit. It would be like Well, I forget where I heard this, but it was in the Vietnam War. There was someone who said charging someone for murder was like charging someone for speeding at the Indy 500. That's what it would be like 100 years ago if you're looking for politically incorrect comments. I mean, it was not just that, but it was like way actually more serious, not just words we're talking about, but policies that were crafted, enacted, and copied by the Nazis, but first put into practice here. So let's look at some of the examples here. And Huxley's brother, Huxley came from a family of scientists. His brother, Julian Huxley, was in favor of eugenics, but I don't know exactly what he was in favor of, so I'll leave it at that. The term eugenics was coined by Francis Galton, British scientist, who was influenced by Darwin's theory of natural selection, and he advocated for the preservation of more suitable races over the less suitable, in his terms. The chair of eugenics at University College London passed from him to Karl Pearson, who was a brilliant mathematician. And all these guys they know what they're doing, which is interesting because it reminds you of Brave New World, like they're not complete idiots here. Anyways, he believed that the high birth rate of the lower classes threatened civilization and that the higher races should supplant the lower ones. In the United States, the Immigration Act of 1924 established quotas for immigrants, reducing numbers from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, and completely barring those from Asia. Interesting because the scientific racism that it was based on ranked even white people, those from Southern and Eastern Europe, inferior to Northwestern Europe. It was also anti-Semitic. The United States did nothing to aid Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany until the war was over, and the law itself was not overturned until 1965. Lastly, sterilization in the U.S. Around 60,000 people were sterilized involuntarily when eugenics was popular in the country. The Nazis directly euthanized people that were undesirable. This was a little too hardcore for the intelligentsia scientists who were for these policies in Britain and America, but it's important that their sterilization policy was modeled after the work of American professor Harry H. Laughlin. The Allied powers in World War II, they simply didn't fight fascism because they really cared about minorities or Jews. If you think that, you're naive. Stalin himself persecuted Jews after the war was over, and the USA, as we all know, needed a civil rights movement to make the country a fully fledged and complete democracy. So, again, if you delve into scientific racism, you can see why Huxley was concerned about it, and, among other trends in the 20th century. The Human Genome Project mapped the human genome, the set of DNA-encoded sequences in each of the 23 pairs of chromosomes in each cell nuclei, around 3 billion letters total. The genome is further divided into around 20,000 genes, which transmits the hereditary traits from parents to offspring. So for a classical philologist, I didn't understand this very well, and I still don't exactly know what genes are. It was like a seminar in biology class, but it was pretty interesting nonetheless. I did learn this, though. This is clear to me. The genes in people are mostly the same. It's the variations in the letters of the DNA sequences that produce differences. The documentary Dangerous Idea, produced by litigator, activist Andrew Kimball, whom I listen to on Ralph Nader's podcast, everyone should know who he is, progressive activist, famous litigator, persuaded me that biological determinism, which underlined eugenics, is false, and that complex personality traits cannot be extracted from looking at the genetic data alone. Environmental determinism, on the other hand, is also wrong. Economic determinism, which they didn't spend as much time in this documentary on debunking, that is also wrong. Their focus was primarily on you can tell where their biases are, but they persuaded me that biological determinism was definitely false, but something like economic determinism does also not persuade me. For example, that poverty is the source of crime. It's definitely a factor among many others, but my grandparents were dirt poor, during the Great Depression, and they didn't, resort to crime. Bernie Madoff, it wasn't poverty that coerced him into conning people via Ponzi scheme. And Plato will probably say that if you're a rich person and you're constantly money grubbing, constantly wanting money just for the sake of having it, you really act like you're poor. Your life is empty. So anyways, I found the genetic scholarship to be confusing as a layman, but I didn't really come out of it knowing much that I didn't already know before, that it's a combination of nurture and nature that contribute to behavior, complex personality traits. You'll notice that if you have more of a left-wing bias, you'll emphasize more of the environmental factors. If you have a right-wing bias, like Charles Murray, for example, you'll emphasize the genes more. Some applications of the Human Genome Project mentioned above have been referred to as Brave New World. Gattaca, inspired by Brave New World and Huxley's novel, I think basically had the science right, that these dystopian world states have based their society on a false premise, that you can't just pick a winner by looking at genes, that biological determinism is false, cannot determine complex behavioral traits simply by looking at genes. Indeed, if you've read Brave New World or you've seen the first part of my presentation here on YouTube, I talked a lot about how Huxley strongly emphasizes in conditioning and environment, that in order to create this stratified society. So I was primarily interested in how relevant the novel was, looking into this history of genetics, eugenics and genetic engineering, but I have to admit the science was pretty interesting, and I did go into a little bit of a rabbit hole. But to return to Brave New World, the world state has subjectively determined what traits are desirable and undesirable to create its caste system, which governs the lives of these so-called civilized people, unlike the savages living on the fringes and the reservations where John the Savage, the protagonist, was from. Regarding CRISPR, no doubt it deserves its Nobel Prize. The scientists interviewed seem to be quite rational and aware that modifying DNA genetic material is risky and should be done with caution. In particular, I found Dr. Fyodor Urnov, a CRISPR researcher who wrote a piece in the journal Nature. Do not edit the human germline. I found him particularly persuasive, at least his caution, on editing the germline. The point was, editing eggs, sperm, embryos will be passed on to future generations, unlike somatic cells. This means, basically, unintended consequences for future generations. The bioethicists reached the conclusion, as you'll see in the documentary if you see it, however, that there was nothing intrinsically evil editing the germline. And as I said earlier, I tend to err on the side of caution. I was with Dr. Urnov, but on the other side, there were good arguments, and it's hard to not have empathy for those suffering from genetic diseases that could be cured by this technology. It's the small changes in the genes, often a single letter among the 3 billion letters of the human genome, that can lead to diseases. And while looking into this, I was reminded of the Da Vinci Code and how silly it kind of was. It's just not the way genes work. At the end of the film, there would be way more than a handful of people with Christ's genes, if he did pass on his genes. But anyways, with Brave New World, the regime has affected the gene pool in really catastrophic ways. It shows made worse by their ostracism of conception the natural way outside of the laboratory. So their caste system is pretty solidified. And I would argue that the novel is about bad apples in the scientific community who don't think about, or they just ignore the consequences of messing with powerful technology like this. I liked most of the scientists, even the ones that I thought were weird or I didn't even agree with. I still thought most of them were rational, careful, aware of concerns with this technology. There were a couple that gave, funny, weird responses. One of the scientists, Stephen Hsu, co-founder of Genomic Prediction, said, "Sex is for procreation and science is for procreation." I mean, this would be like a line straight out of Brave New World. Test tube babies. My first response was, honestly, find someone attractive to say that or don't say it at all. because you look like a weird, dangerous nerd. Then I thought, that's not really fair, because what does attractive mean? Nobody's going to agree on that. And I know as a graduate student, and now I've disliked postmodernism, and then I end up asking questions that they've already asked themselves, to give the devil his due. Yeah, I don't feel too bad about that, because smarter people than me, Dr. Jordan Peterson, have done the same thing. So to give credit to the postmodernists, I mean, there are some things quite subjective, like beauty, like attractiveness, that the majority might agree on, but not completely. And then I realized, yeah, we've all made eugenics adjacent decisions in our lives. Every single one of us has veered close to this. When we select for traits in our personal relationships, we've made decisions on what genes that we want in our children. Like screening for disease, mental illness. This is the key issue. You screen for those things, and where do you draw the line? And to go macro, we've been doing this on a grand scale. Like, since the agricultural revolution, we've made irrevocable changes in the crops, grain crops, domesticated animals that we've been selectively breeding for millennia. In fact, what's funny is, you ask a hardcore left-wing feminist how many men she's screened and declined with extreme prejudice versus how many women have been declined for sex by a young man, who's going to be more prejudicial here. And not for, no good reasons at all. Everyone has biases, some degree of prejudice, and not exactly without reason. In my family, there's been a history of mental illness, and I did screen for that in my wife, who is mentally quite healthy. She's not white, but she does have virtues, which are at the top of the list of traits that I find desirable. Not to be crude, but if you find big tits to be desirable traits, you better make sure that she has big virtues to go along with that. Anyways, editing the germline, to get back to the point and away from fun parts, let's use that euphemism. Editing the germline with CRISPR is quite different than people using their own freedom to choose their mate. This is the issue here. Another problem, this was interesting, is the cost. So, if I'm not mistaken right now, it's pretty expensive. So poor people couldn't pay for this technology to fully screen, edit, select traits in a laboratory. So, and having the government pay for parents to modify their children presents its own problems. So like Brave New World, if this would fall into just the hands of the elites, you could theoretically create an actual caste system. I don't even know if the technology is there, but just as a thought experiment, you could do something like that, and it wouldn't be like a conspiracy or design necessarily from the beginning. Dr. Ryan Phelan, co-founder of Revive and Restore, was one of the scientists they interviewed. She was asked about Jurassic Park, and she said that she tries to avoid talking about it. And she said that the point was mainly hubris, and she's correct in that. Using biotechnology to do things like restore coral species and helping preserve endangered species makes sense to me, seems honorable. In fact, she's probably being a little bit more generous than I would be. There's passages in Michael Crichton's novel that seem like polemics, ham-fisted polemics that kind of beat the reader over his head with it against the scientific community. Still one of my favorite novels, though. But when she says in the documentary Human Nature that we're not playing God, in the sense that scientists like her are very careful and rational and not playing, I agree when she says it. I don't sense hubris from her or Dr. Church, the guy who is trying to resurrect the mammoth species. That's fascinating. Do it. If it was up to me, can we make dinosaurs? Yeah, do it immediately. I want to see them. But with caution, with rules, regulations, all this stuff. And neither from, I don't sense hubris either from Dr. Jennifer Doudna, one of the Nobel Prize winners for CRISPR, who she even said she had a nightmare of Hitler in her dream asking her about CRISPR and Cas9 technology. So evidently, they're aware of what they're doing. They're aware of the concerns here. So, but if you recall someone like Dr. Jim Watson, who co-discovered with Francis Crick the structure of the DNA, the double helix, he said, in all honesty, if scientists don't play God, who will? I found this to be a very unsophisticated response. it was from the same person who said, he said he was gloomy about the prospects of Africa because, end quote, all our social policies are based on the fact that their intelligence is the same as ours, whereas all the testing says not really. He also stated about the equality of black employees, people who have to deal with them find this not true. So it's definitely not just the eugenicists in the early 20th century that we have to think about. But I'll say this on Dr. Watson. No doubt there are cowards on the right wing whose lack of courage prevents them from saying how racist they really are. No doubt there's cowards on the left who've seen colleagues become victims of the irrational, childish cancel culture, who enjoy a kind of herd immunity of a different kind. But whatever vices Dr. Watson has, I think he's wrong. But whatever vices he has, cowardice is not among them. If you have controversial ideas, don't add to it by being a coward. So more bad apples on the topic of genetic engineering. The gain-of-function research of Drs. Ron Fouchier and Yoshihiro Kawaka on the H5N1 avian influenza, which had a 60% mortality rate, where they mutated this virus, not easily transmissible, into a transmissible airborne virus between ferrets whose respiratory system is like humans. This resulted, as you know, in the 2014 moratorium by President Obama on gain-of-function research after a global uproar within the scientific community on this stuff, self-imposed. So if you've read Brave New World, you immediately know that President Trump, former President Trump, is not a good analogy for the world controller. He's just too inept. He was too incompetent. The neocons, Bush, Cheney, now they're just corrupt war criminals. I mean, they're just not... They don't match up well with the world controllers. I mean, as wrong as they are and dystopian as the society is, they were competent and well-intentioned. The best fit for me for Mustafa Mond, the best analogy is Dr. Fauci. And he's the first person I think of, because their underlying argument during the pandemic is very similar to Mond's basic argument that the noble lie is necessary, that the public cannot be trusted to do the right thing. You can say that I got the vaccine and got boosted in spite of the narcissist Dr. Fauci. I really don't like him. I don't think that he's not as sinister as some of the Republican politicians make him out to be, but he has an arrogant streak. It may not be surprising for a bureaucrat, but I don't think it's appropriate as a chief medical advisor. I don't think he's as sinister as the Republicans like to make him out to be, but I don't like him, though. Nonetheless, if it was only him saying to get the vaccine, I probably would be a lot more skeptical. But for me, it was pretty simple. My wife has one of the underlying conditions, and that would put her at risk, and so there was no choice for me. As an introvert, I can't speak for all introverts, but it takes a while to get your soulmate, and it would have been a shame if I killed her with COVID right before the wedding. So, not an option for me. I got it. Doesn't mean I like Dr. Fauci. Having a knee-jerk response to anything the government says, whether you agree with all of it or against all of it, that is groupthink. That is like you voluntarily put yourself into some kind of an imperfect bubble, but adjacent to the insular thinking of the caste system in Brave New World. And it is interesting how politicized the debate on both sides has become during this COVID pandemic. But to return to Dr. Fauci as an analogy to his Fordship, as he's known, the world controller of Western Europe, Mustafa Mond, Fauci lied about the efficacy of the masks. He also lied about herd immunity. At worst, he suppressed the lab leak hypothesis in the emails that Republican Oversight Committee got via Freedom of Information Act. He and Collins referred to it as a conspiracy theory, shiny object that will go away. And one scientist in the email is concerned about the furin cleavage site in COVID, SARS-CoV-2 to be specific, which was unlikely to occur in nature, a virus primed already for transmission to humans, which is interesting because EcoHealth wrote a grant turned down by DARPA as too risky that wished to do precisely that with SARS-like viruses. At best, not as eager to pursue the truth as he should have been. And even China now dismisses the wet market theory, and Dr. Fauci has admitted the possibility of a leak. So with Moving on with gain-of-function research, at best, the Wuhan lab funded by EcoHealth, with funds dispersed by NIAID, which he's the director of, was sloppy. As you know, Dr. Fauci got around the moratorium in President Trump's administration because the latter is so inept. The Intercept, which obtained the full grant proposal and reports via Freedom of Information Act request and a lawsuit, shows that the lab tested mutated coronaviruses by increasing transmissibility by swapping in a spike protein on mice with a human ACE2 receptor, so make it like humanized mice if you want to look at it that way. The mice lost weight and showed increased viral particles in their lungs. So at worst, he just lied about the gain of function. EcoHealth was told that its experiments must stop after growth rates of 10 times, and in fact they showed growth rates of up to 10,000 times. But Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, his colleague, just awarded them another grant. So if that's not gain of function, find a name you fucking like and ban it. So I don't like him. I don't like Mustafa Ahmad. Both are hyper-intelligent. I would assume they're well-intentioned and wrong. Two truths can be present at the same time. So basically, you don't have to wait until we start to do eugenics-like experiments, genetic engineering on humans to get, disturbed about what bureaucrats are doing, which is essentially who the antagonists are in Brave New World. Bureaucrats like Dr. Fauci. Despite, all those lies, obfuscations. I mean, Mon's not a liar. He just is so rationalized what he's done that he can't be convinced otherwise. But despite all of that, as you know, Dr. Fauci claimed to be science when anyone criticizes him. I mean, come on. Albert Einstein, when he was wrong about the expansion of the universe, he just said, oh, okay, I was wrong about that. He didn't say, wait, what are you doing? I'm science, right? No individual is science. I mean, the scientific method is science, but not an individual. In fact, when he said that, I was thinking of Louis XIV when he said, I am the state. I mean, in that sense, it kind of makes sense metaphorically. Symbol of France. Then after a point in time when the French people got tired of the lies, malfeasance, incompetence, corruption of the French monarchy became a symbol of the past. Anyways, to conclude on this stuff, it's interesting, but not the point. The gain of function research, not what caused the pandemic, but these novel viruses, too genetically distant to be the SARS-CoV-2, but it is an example of genetic engineering. And to reiterate, don't need to wait until we start genetically engineering people, if ever, to ask questions about this matter. And to reiterate for the last time, all the scientists in human nature, even some of the weird nerds, I liked all of them, thought all of them rational. They were all rational, made sense. Some of their projects seemed honorable. Protect endangered species, etc. These aren't the days of the early 20th century when Huxley was writing, but I would say the novel is still relevant as a cautionary tale. So, in conclusion, the question is an interesting one. Is the general public, at least the majority, competent and willing to take the most ethical and rational course of action? So in Brave New World, the choice is removed from their hands. And more or less they seem to voluntarily do so. I mean, centuries in development, this stable regime is. The bureaucrats in charge reached the conclusion that freedom is simply too dangerous, so it must be destroyed. It is the question that the bureaucrats, but not just them, people in general, reached in Brave New World after their worldwide cataclysmic 9 years war and great economic collapse, which, as you know, is World War I, Great Depression. But it wouldn't be an interesting question if the evidence was completely unambiguous. So here's some examples worth thinking about in the United States. In a poll in 2003, now granted this was after the Bush administration's lies about WMDs, but around 72% of Americans were for the war in Iraq. 2008 dropped to 38%. And there is no direct vote here. So, I mean, if you got tired of something like the Iraq war, we can't vote to end it. It's not for better or worse, there's no direct vote here. It's a topic for another time. I know the second case study here is controversial for some. For me, definitely against the mandates. Totally opposed to that, but I mean, for the sake of my wife, at the very least, no question I was going to get the vaccine. But yeah, the mandates, and definitely for kids, I found that creepy, to say the least. But 76% received one dose, 64% fully vaccinated. The libertarians, I know where they would stand on this. I don't necessarily think the government is the issue, because at least it's somewhat accountable to the public. Ours, at least. In Brave New World, it's whatever they say goes. Nonetheless, it's people who run the government, and so in a libertarian utopia, the seeds of dystopia lie in every utopia. But my conclusion, I'd say, on both presentations that I've done on Brave New World my conclusion is dishonesty is a vice. And when you grant unlimited powers to be dishonest, to lie to a government or a private tyranny, a corporation, doesn't matter. Even if it's a well-intentioned, noble lie, everybody has self-interest. So how do you know when they're drawing the line here, when they're lying to you? The answer is they don't do it well. So if a government has been given the power to lie and to disseminate a noble lie if they deem necessary, and since every person has self-interest, how well do bureaucrats draw the line when they lie? And let's assume their intentions are good. The answer is they don't draw the line well. They don't do it well. And that would be my conclusion on Brave New World. Surrendering freedom, total freedom, is chaos, not for that. But surrendering hard-fought freedoms, do so with caution, because it's difficult to get them back.